In the cold January morning of 1318, a 7-year-old girl trembled uncontrollably while servants adjusted her heavy ceremonial dress. The golden fabric and jewels that adorned it seemed to crush her tiny body. Silent tears ran down her childish cheeks while her lady companion tried to calm her. This girl was not crying from caprice or tantrum. She was crying because that evening she would be given as a wife to a man almost 30 years older, a foreigner she barely knew, a king notorious for his brutal appetites. This girl was Isabella of France, daughter of King Philip IV, and that day she would embark on a journey that would transform her from an innocent victim into one of the most lethal figures in medieval history. The marriage between Isabella and Edward II of England was not a case of love, nor even of simple political alliance. It was a commercial transaction covered by the veneer of diplomacy. France and England were in constant conflict over the control of Gascony, a rich wine-producing region. For Philip I, the cunning and calculating French king known as the Fair, his younger daughter was just another piece on the geopolitical board, human currency to buy a temporary truce. England would receive a princess of French royal blood. France would gain an ally within the English court, eyes and ears beside the enemy throne. No one worried about what little Isabella thought about being torn from her family and sent to a foreign country, whose language she didn't even speak. The destiny of princesses was never in their own hands. They were born as diplomatic tools, and Isabella was no exception. The marriage ceremony in Boulogne was an ostentatious spectacle of power and wealth. King Edward II, then 23 years old, was physically imposing. Tall and muscular, considered one of the most handsome men of his time. But when the little bride entered the cathedral, what should have been the happiest day of her life was already being stained by a scandal that everyone whispered about. The English king could barely disguise his indifference toward the girl who was now his wife. His eyes constantly searched the crowd for the face of Piers Gaveston, his favorite and, as many suspected, his lover. While Isabella stood diminutive under the weight of the matrimonial crown, Edward and Gaveston exchanged complicit glances. Gifts intended for the bride had been redirected to Gaveston, who displayed them with arrogance. The public humiliation of the princess child was merely the prelude to years of neglect and contempt. As a chronicler of the time recorded, the little queen remained alone and in silence, while the king danced all night with his dear peers. Isabella's first years in England were marked by profound isolation. Despite being technically queen, she remained a child, far from her family in a strange country where few spoke her native language. Her husband rarely visited her, preferring to spend time and crown resources with Gaveston. The English barons, initially compassionate with the young abandoned queen, quickly became hostile toward the royal favorite, whose influence over Edward seemed to have no limits. In 1312, tension exploded into open violence. Gaveston, who had been exiled and had returned multiple times, was captured by the rebel barons led by the Earl of Lancaster. Without formal trial, he was taken to the top of a remote hill and beheaded. His head was sent back to London as a grim warning to the king. Edward's reaction was one of unbridled grief. For weeks he locked himself in his chambers, refusing food and company, weeping for his lost favorite. Isabella, now 12 years old and still a wife only in name, watched her husband's desperation with a mixture of childish confusion and growing understanding of what it meant to be a dispensable queen. Gaveston's death should have been the moment when the king finally turned his eyes toward his young queen, wrote a chronicler. Instead, he replaced one favorite with another, even more harmful than the first. This new favorite was Hugh Despenser, an ambitious and cruel noble who quickly secured his control over the unstable Edward. 4 years later, when Isabella finally reached the age traditionally considered suitable for consummating the marriage, she had already learned bitter lessons about power and survival. Edward, who had rarely shown interest in his wife, now needed her to fulfill his most basic dynastic duty: produce an heir. Finally, in 1316, Isabella gave birth to a son, the future Edward III. In the following years, Isabella would demonstrate surprising fertility, giving the king 3 more children. Her position at court seemed momentarily strengthened by her success as a royal breeder. However, Edward soon returned to his old habits, neglecting the queen in favor of Despenser, who gradually accumulated lands, titles, and power. Meanwhile, Isabella watched, learned, and waited. The turning point came when Edward and Despenser began to confiscate Isabella's properties and revenues, leaving her financially vulnerable. The queen was deprived even of the small dignities of her position, recorded a monk chronicler. Her servants were dismissed, her jewels confiscated, and she was forced to beg for funds to maintain her royal household. This final humiliation awakened something in the queen that would surprise everyone, even herself. The frightened girl who had arrived in England had transformed into a woman determined to survive, whatever the cost. An opportunity arose in 1325, when tensions with France required diplomacy. Isabella, now 25 years old and fluent in both languages, offered to negotiate with her brother, now King of France, as Charles IV. Reluctantly, Edward allowed his wife to travel as his emissary. It was a mistake he would pay for with his crown and eventually with his life. Once in Paris, Isabella did not return. Instead, she met with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English baron and mortal enemy of the Despensers who had escaped from the Tower of London in a daring breakout. What began as a political alliance quickly transformed into a passionate romance. Mortimer, experienced, charismatic, and thirsty for revenge, recognized in Isabella an ideal companion for his plans to overthrow Edward. For the queen, for so many years deprived of any affection or consideration, Mortimer offered not only physical love, but an opportunity for revenge against her husband and his detested favorite. The queen, for so long a lamb, revealed herself a wolf, wrote a chronicler shocked by Isabella's transformation. In the French court, she abandoned the role of submissive wife and adopted a new persona, that of an aggrieved queen, a mother concerned about the future of her son, heir to the English throne. Publicly, she declared that she would not return to England while the Despensers maintained their influence over the king. Edward, furious with his wife's open rebellion, ordered her to return immediately. When Isabella refused, he tried to force her using his most powerful card, the couple's son. The king demanded that young Edward, then barely 12 years old, be sent to Paris to visit his mother. In reality, a plan to lure Isabella back, using her maternal love as bait. Isabella, however, had learned to play the game of power, managing to have her son named Duke of Aquitaine. She arranged for the young prince to legitimately travel to France to pay homage to the French king for this territory. Once reunited with her son, Isabella completed her transformation from victim to avenger. With the heir to the throne under her custody, French financing, and mercenaries provided by allies in the Low Countries, she and Mortimer prepared an invasion of England. In September 1326, Isabella returned to the country not as a submissive queen, but as a conqueror at the head of an army. In an extraordinary turn, she was received not as an invader, but as a liberator. The English people, long discontented with Edward's chaotic reign and the Despensers' corruption, embraced the rebel queen. Nobles and clergy, cities and towns declared their support for the good queen against the wicked king. Edward and the Despensers fled west, seeking refuge in Wales, but were quickly captured. Isabella's revenge was swift and brutal. Hugh Despenser, the man who had usurped her position and dignity, was subjected to a mock trial and condemned to one of the most horrific executions in medieval history. First, he was dragged through the streets tied to horses, then hanged on a gallows so high that everyone could see him. Still conscious, he was lowered and tied to a ladder. His body was then methodically mutilated, his genitals cut off and burned before his eyes, his entrails ripped out and incinerated, and finally his heart torn out and thrown into the fire. Only then, nearly dead, was he beheaded. Despenser's grotesque execution was a public spectacle deliberately staged to demonstrate the fate of traitors and send a clear message. The queen who had once been powerless now controlled the power of life and death. To complete her revenge, Isabella forced Edward to abdicate in favor of his son, the young Edward III. The deposed king was initially kept in relative comfort, confined in Kenilworth Castle. However, rescue attempts led to the decision to transfer him to the more secure and sinister Berkeley Castle. It was there, in September 1327, where the darkest episode of Isabella's reign occurred. The exact circumstances of Edward II's death remain shrouded in mystery and controversy, but the most accepted and most horrible version involves a particularly cruel assassination. According to accounts of the time, the assassins, probably acting under Mortimer's orders with Isabella's tacit knowledge, inserted a red-hot metal tube into the former king's anus. This barbaric method was intended to cause fatal internal damage without leaving external marks on the body, allowing them to claim that the death had been natural. Edward's screams of agony were so terrible that they could be heard beyond the castle's thick walls, echoing in the night as final testimony to his downfall. The man who had been King of England, who had led his country to defeat at Bannockburn, who had preferred rowers and favorites over his own wife, died in indescribable pain, victim of a revenge orchestrated by the same frightened girl he had despised. For so many years, with her husband dead and her son still a minor, Isabella and Mortimer ruled England as de facto regents. The lovers made no effort to hide their relationship, living openly in scandalous luxury. They appropriated the properties of their coup's victims, accumulating an immense personal fortune. Mortimer adopted the unprecedented title of Earl of March, positioning himself above the other nobles of the realm. The same barons who had supported Isabella against Edward now found themselves governed by an even more tyrannical regime. For 3 years, the couple maintained control over the young king and the country. Isabella had finally achieved the power that had been denied her during her marriage, transforming from victim to oppressor. However, she made the same mistake as her husband. She underestimated the next generation. Edward III, now a teenager, watched with growing discontent the behavior of his mother and Mortimer. The young king had not forgotten that regardless of his father's sins, Edward II had been humiliated, deposed, and probably murdered under the orders of his own wife and her lover. Using a secret passage in Nottingham Castle where the court was lodged, the king and his allies invaded Mortimer's chambers in the middle of the night. There are accounts that Isabella begged for mercy for her lover, shouting the famous words, "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer." Her pleas were ignored. Mortimer was arrested, quickly tried for usurping royal power, and hanged as a common traitor at Tyburn. Surprisingly, Edward III spared his mother from the same fate. Isabella was not tried nor publicly humiliated. Instead, she was removed from court and her political powers stripped. Her extensive properties were confiscated, though a generous pension was maintained for her sustenance. The young king, demonstrating political wisdom that would define his long reign, recognized that executing one's own mother, however guilty she might be, would be politically disastrous and morally repugnant. Isabella of France, the she-wolf queen as she would be known, spent the last 28 years of her life in almost monastic retirement at Castle Rising in Norfolk. Some accounts suggest that her mind eventually failed, that she was tormented by visions of her dead husband and nightmares about her own complicity in the horrors of his assassination. Others indicate that she found late peace, dedicating herself to charitable works and religious devotion. The truth is that when she died in August 1358, at 67 years old, Isabella was buried wearing a nun's habit and with Edward II's heart in a reliquary on her chest. A final gesture of remorse or symbolic reconciliation with the man she had helped destroy. In the mansion where Isabella spent her final exile, rumors say that servants and occasional visitors heard the former queen in animated conversations with invisible people. Sometimes she would scream in the middle of the night in French, her native tongue, calling to her father or her son. Other times, more disturbingly, she would whisper Edward's name as if he were beside her bed. A servant reported that in the last months of her life, Isabella demanded that 2 chairs always be placed facing each other in her chambers, one for her, another for the husband she had ordered killed almost 3 decades before. She would ask forgiveness of the empty air, wrote the man in an account later preserved by monks, and sometimes seemed to hear answers that none of us could hear. The rarefied English court that still visited the former queen in her retirement noticed how she occasionally interrupted conversations to stare fixedly at a corner of the hall, as if seeing a specter that only she could see. In her final days, Isabella asked to be buried not with the jewels and finery that had marked her life as queen, but with a simple Franciscan nun's habit. This request was not unusual for repentant nobles of the time, but for a woman who had lived so passionately, who had immersed herself so deeply in the intrigues of the court, and in the blood of revenge seemed a final recognition of the consequences of her choices. An anonymous poem written shortly after her death captured the profound ambivalence that Isabella left as a legacy. The girl who cried when given away, the woman who bled when taking revenge, the queen who ruled by the sword, the penitent who prayed until the end. The story of Isabella of France is one of the most turbulent in medieval history. Child bride forced into a marriage she never desired, neglected and humiliated queen, mother determined to protect her son's rights, passionate lover seeking revenge, tyrannical regent, and finally penitent recluse. She embodied a succession of roles as dramatic as they were contradictory. Her journey from innocence to moral ruin reflects the brutal realities of medieval power and the devastating costs of uncontrolled ambition. More profoundly, her case exposes the terrible vulnerability of women even in the highest positions of medieval society. Isabella arrived in England as political merchandise, a girl sacrificed on the altar of diplomatic alliances. That this girl eventually transformed into a predator does not diminish the fundamental tragedy of her life. Contemporary chroniclers, especially after Isabella's downfall, were quick to demonize her. Thomas Walsingham wrote, "She was a woman of extreme beauty, but of questionable morals, a queen of cruel heart and distorted mind." This judgment, however, reflects more medieval discomfort with female agency than a balanced evaluation of the extraordinary circumstances that shaped her life. When we consider everything Isabella endured, forced child marriage, years of public humiliation, Edward's flagrant demonstrations of preference for his male lovers, and finally the confiscation of her own revenues and properties, her revolt takes on a different character. It was not simply unbridled ambition, but a desperate struggle for survival in a political and social system brutally unfavorable to women. The relationship between Isabella and Mortimer is particularly revealing. While medieval chroniclers portrayed her as a shameless adulteress, more recent analyses suggest the relationship had complex dimensions. For a woman who had never experienced genuine affection in her marriage, Mortimer's care and consideration, however calculated his motivations might have been, offered a human connection previously denied. Isabella, isolated in a foreign country for 20 years, finally found someone willing to see her not just as a receptacle for royal heirs or a diplomatic bargaining chip, but as a person. The most controversial aspect of her life, the alleged murder of Edward II, also deserves deeper consideration. While traditional narrative attributes to Isabella an implacable thirst for revenge, political reality suggests that eliminating the former king may have been a pragmatic necessity. As long as Edward lived, he would be a natural focal point for revolts against the new regime. Several plots to free him had already been discovered in the first months of his imprisonment. In a world where mercy was frequently fatal for those who granted it, allowing Edward to live may have seemed an unacceptable risk. This fact does not diminish the horror of the execution, if it indeed occurred as described. The particularly brutal method, the red-hot metal tube that left no external marks, speaks both to the cruelty of the era and the need to maintain appearances of natural death. The most disturbing question is not whether Isabella ordered the death, but whether she specified the method. Some modern historians question whether Edward actually died at Berkeley in 1327. An alternative theory suggests he may have escaped, possibly with his jailer's connivance, living the rest of his days as a hermit in Italy. An obscure document discovered in Vatican archives contains a letter from Pope John XXII mentioning an encounter with a man he believed was the deposed English king several years after his supposed death. This theory, though intriguing, remains minority among serious scholars. Isabella's death was reported as a moment of strange serenity for such a tumultuous life. They say her last words were, "All shadows come to the same darkness in the end." Whether she found redemption in her final years, no one can say with certainty. What remains is the echo of her story, a warning about how power corrupts and how revenge, however justified it may seem, rarely brings true liberation. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Isabella's story is simply her survival. In a male-dominated world where queens were regularly discarded or eliminated when they became inconvenient, she not only survived but radically transformed her destiny from victim to avenger, momentarily rewriting the rules of the medieval power game. That her victory was temporary and her end solitary does not diminish the extraordinary strength of will she demonstrated. Today, at Castle Rising, where Isabella spent her final years, visitors report strange sensations in the chambers she once inhabited, a restless presence that seems to remain centuries after her death. Night guards and tour guides occasionally speak of a female figure in medieval dress appearing on the castle battlements during storms, looking south toward London as if still contemplating the power she once possessed and lost. The same brutal system that transformed an innocent princess into the child wife of a negligent king also created the she-wolf queen who returned to destroy it. Isabella was not born a monster. She was shaped by the cruelties of her time. And perhaps, in the end, this is the most disturbing lesson of her life. The monsters we fear most are frequently created by our own hands.